Welcome, everybody. Thanks for joining us tonight. We are going to be covering tonight the basics of capital campaigns. My name is Leslie Pendleton. I'm the Associate Program Director for Capital Campaigns with the Episcopal Church Foundation. And what we're going to try to do is just cover the basics of what it takes, what the preparation is, what you can expect. I want to talk a little bit about ECF. But this applies really to any capital campaign you're talking about, whether you're talking about getting help from ECF, a consultant from ECF, or somewhere else. The Episcopal Church Foundation has their own mission. When we come out to churches and help them strengthen their mission, we also have our own mission. We are a not-for-profit 501c3 separate from the national church, and we have an all-lay board. We do not answer to General Convention, but we are housed, our main offices are at 815 2nd Avenue in New York. Our mission is to strengthen the leadership and financial capabilities of Episcopal congregations, dioceses, and communities of faith to pursue their mission in ministry. This is in both the areas of financial resources and leadership resources. When we talk about mission and ministry and funding those things, there are three sources. This may be very obvious to some of you, but it's always a good reminder to people in the pews and to ourselves. There are three areas, three sources for funding that we need to reach to as a church. The first is our annual stewardship or annual campaign. That's for your budget, for your operating budget. Just like in our budgets at home, in our own personal lives, we have expenses week to week, day to day, month to month. That's what your annual stewardship is for. Capital giving, or capital campaigns, is an extraordinary giving time, just as if you needed to pave your driveway or put a new roof on your house. The same happens in our churches. So this is a time you're asking people to reach deep or to reach into other sources of income, such as accumulated assets, savings, stocks, or to just reach deeper into their annual budgets themselves. And then we have planned giving, something the Episcopal Church has not done a great job of talking about, probably not many churches really at all. Our universities and libraries and hospitals have done a very good job. Our NPR has done a great job. This is talking to people about remembering their church in their will and making plans after they leave to financially support their church after they're gone. So one of the things that might be going on with your vestries or your boards as far as beating around the bush of whether you really need to take care of that leaking roof. Are we ready for a capital campaign? I spoke to a gentleman today, a priest of a parish, who just introduced this concept to his vestry, and he thought he was going to have a big pushback and people were going to be very upset. And they all sort of looked at this piece of paper and said, oh yeah, I guess that's true. So he was really surprised that everybody knew this, but nobody really wanted to bring it up. So I told him I'm not surprised. It's sort of like thinking you're going to be the first person to say we all need to go to the dentist. But honestly, it can be a really transformational time in a congregation. It can really help focus mission and really dust yourselves off for the future. Much more, done right, it is much more than just a fundraising campaign. So the fundraising process is really at the very end of a very successful process. So what are the least visible parts of this process is what I'm going to mostly focus on. The visible part of this iceberg is the ask, is the money. The other is the very important stuff that gets you there. You need to identify your need. You need to identify potential donors. You need to communicate the vision, ask for support, say thank you, and continue the process. This applies to your annual as well and your planned giving. So this is fundraising in general. At the Episcopal Church Foundation, we have three phases of a capital campaign. Many fundraising, other professional fundraisers start with a feasibility study and include a portion of discernment within that feasibility study. We've found that churches are at such a different point in the area of discernment that it makes sense to break it out as its own phase. And honestly, it is the most important part of a campaign. You aren't even to campaign. You're not talking about money necessarily yet, but it is the foundation for a successful campaign. The feasibility study is really the measurement, is really your black and white report with facts and giving people another ability to check in and communicate and give you the feedback on really how you did discernment. And then when you get to the ask or the campaign, this is the solicitation process. This is where people are at this point should be very happy to give and very much expecting what's coming. But let's start with discernment. We are honestly looking for a new word for this because I think the church has become a little weary of the word discernment. We discern our future, we discern our new rector, we discern everything. But it really is the word. We're asking, what is God calling you to do or become? So part of this discernment piece is creating ownership and involvement within the congregation. And this means everyone in the pews. We will get calls from many churches that say, you know what, we have a strategic plan, we have an architect, we have been studying this for years, we have a fabulous buildings and grounds committee, we're ready to go. Will you do a feasibility study for us? And we have to really push back and ask some questions at that point. That's all fabulous progress. But often when I ask, who outside of the vestry, your buildings and grounds committee, and your finance committee know the real details about this? Who's been in the conversation? That's when people say, well, they haven't been, so let's do a feasibility study. People in the pews who are going to be asked to support these projects need to have input on the ideas to begin with, at least to be asked what they think of them, so that they can begin to catch up with the leadership on this. You know, it often doesn't veer very far from the people who have done some hard work. So you really have to, I tell leaders, you know, now's the time for you to go to sit down and let people catch up. So you want to help people identify the needs. Maybe you have identified the needs and you need to communicate the needs. They need to be connected to your mission and ministry in the church. You need to involve the leaders, stakeholders, and visionaries. And stakeholders means everyone who's in the congregation, down to the person who can make a very small pledge. It is important, and we do reach for those pledges as well. They are part of the body. And to communicate the vision. So identifying the needs. What is the campaign for? You need to identify your building projects. You need to identify program needs. Are there programs that might need support or seed money? Is there a new ministry that you're thinking about starting? Endowments can be funded through campaigns. If you have some very good structure We want your endowment to have gift acceptance policies and a good structure around it so that people know what it's used for. Then they will feel better about giving for an endowment campaign, and also that leads to more gifts for your planned giving program that people will remember in their will. And debt retirement is indeed a very good case for a capital campaign and can very much be linked to mission and ministry, especially if you're talking about freeing up annual funds for ministry. You need to be able to connect all of this to your mission. So what are you called to do? This is the question you need to be asking at this point. Even if your roof is leaking, you have mundane deferred maintenance, let's say. Well, what would it mean to us as a community of faith if we didn't have these building issues hanging over our head, if we didn't have debt? How would these projects help us do it better, more faithfully? What would newcomers coming through the door think of this church that looks like it's got its act together, honestly? So there is a case to be made, and that's what you want people to really be connecting to at this point. Not the leaking and not the costs. Think bigger, and then think, how do we fund what we're dreaming about here? Whoops, let me skip that. Involving your leaders and stakeholders. You want to form a committee, and this is the very beginning. You want them representative of the congregation. At ECF, we are very, very committed to encouraging lay leadership, especially in campaigns like this, but across the board. This should not be the burden for your rector. Your clergy have better things to do, honestly. Certainly we need their input, we'd love their support, we want their backing, but this is really the future of your church that your priest is not going to be a part of for centuries to come. This is your church and your legacy. So we really need lay leaders to take the lead here, and this entire process also will be raising up leadership along the way. We tend to, really the gold standard here is to have small group meetings where people can be in small, safe groups to exchange ideas. And I have identified a big question ahead of time. So what is it that we want people to talk about? Is it where are we going? Is it what do we do well? Just so that people can get together and talk about and dream about the future of their church. It's a great time to get to know each other a little bit better, fellowship, and some really interesting, inspiring ideas come out of these groups. All parish meetings, of course, to meet with groups. Individual meetings, one-on-one, for those with specific interests and maybe means to fund something they're interested in that the parish is interested in. And obviously, we would condone you consulting professionals. Talk to other consultants. Find out other ways to do this. It's a free, everybody would offer a free on-site visit to explain to your leadership the methodology they use for a campaign, their fees, what's included with that. So do take the time to do that, and that's often the best first step for educating your leadership in what it means to embark on a campaign. And communicate the vision. So this is also what I call the communication phase. Discernment is the listening and communicating phase. Leadership needs to hear, listen to ideas, accept all ideas, as nutty as they may be. It's time to hear them, and then to communicate also what's already been looked at. What are the facts? How bad is the roof? Have we had a building survey? That sort of thing. This is setting the tone of transparency and open communications that's going to be key throughout all three phases of the campaign, from the first introduction to the last pledge gotten. I've had many clients where, in addition to just a capital campaign, we were also working on gaining back trust because of a campaign that had been botched before, because of slippery financial practices in the past. The best way to get there is to prove that this time is transparent, above board, and successful. Before you move on to feasibility study, the proposed plans and costs are shared with the congregation, and final plans are approved by the vestry. You are, at this point, approving projects that will be tested, not necessarily what you're going to be raising money for, but you're finding out here are the projects that seem to have a whole lot of interest behind them. We're going to see now what the congregation as a whole thinks in a more detailed capacity through a feasibility study. Honestly, the feasibility study ensures the success of your campaign. If you skip this step, you are going into what everybody says. I really have no idea what the capacity of forgiving is in the congregation. Our feasibility study, and most feasibility studies that are done, they're there to measure the awareness and support of the campaign. If there's a red flag that hasn't been identified, there's a 50% split in your congregation between who would love new chairs and who wants to keep the old pews, you want to know that before you go into actually asking people to support it. So this will also identify volunteers. You will have a list of projects and people will prioritize them. So you'll see which projects are at the top of the list, which projects maybe people would love to have, but at this point they can't be the top priority in comparison to the other projects. And we would come back to you with an amount that we would recommend be the goal for your campaign. So it's really measuring how much you can raise. Ours is a 3-month process. We design and print a tentative case statement, or just a case statement and a survey. It's very basic, black and white. It has some initial drawings if you're talking about building or modifying a space. That can be included. But it says why you're raising money for these projects, how these projects will enhance the ministry in the church, and how much they will cost. And that is a very important piece of this. You want your estimates on costs for these to be as close to reality as possible, because this is what people are looking at. If you start getting really off on that or under, that means in the end other projects are going to suffer. So the really accurate research is all being done in discernment and throughout feasibility study as well, in some cases. We compile and analyze all of the results from the study and report back to the congregation with recommendations, that being the total that we think you should go for. And 92% of ECF clients meet or exceed the recommended goal. So the reason for this, why not just, if you need $1 million, why not do a campaign and see what you can raise, and God will provide, right? Let's say you had $1 million worth of projects and you went about that way. And let's say you really knew you couldn't raise $1 million, but you were going to try. And you raised $750,000. You now have raised $750,000, a good amount of money, for a failed campaign. People will be upset. They'll feel like it was a failure. They'll feel like people didn't support it. And now somebody has to decide what won't be done, what doesn't get done. And that right there has set you up for the nasty memories that will last in your church DNA for years to come. Better to find that attainable goal, define the projects that you want to raise money for, raise that money, and do what you said you were going to do. I'll get into that a little bit more. So you've done your feasibility study. You have all this information. You have the fiduciary responsibility of your vestry, knowing, okay, if the walls are falling down, that has to be a priority. How are we going to deal with that? You have the information from your feasibility study. Now you go back to the drawing board and say, here's the amount of money we need to raise. And if we raise this amount of money, we will do project A, B, and C. Perhaps project D and E have fallen off the list because they were not high priorities, they were great ideas that just can't be handled at this time, or maybe they're so compelling that you want to do a challenge goal, meaning if we can raise this much over our goal, we can add this project back. But this is the transparent key part to your campaign. I call this the covenant with your donors, your capital campaign brochure. So you've now entered your campaign phase. Honestly, with the delivery of the feasibility report, that really builds momentum and excitement in the congregation, where you see the number of people who are in support of it, you really see it's possible. The campaign part is a 4 to 6 month process. I think I neglected to say the feasibility study is a 3-month process, and your discernment process is anywhere from 2 weeks to 2 years. So that one is really quite variable. You start with the preparation of your brochure, your campaign materials, planning, development. You want to recruit leadership. This is when we'll start asking for people if they would be willing to make peer-to-peer asks. We train volunteers. We do not do it ourselves. So if you are looking for a consultant to come on site and make the asks of your people for you, we are not the people for you. We believe that we will leave you stronger and in a much more faith-centered, strength-empowered place, having your own people talk about why their church is important to them and hearing the stories of others. We could certainly come on site and do that, but we don't feel it would leave you in any better of a position. We do an advanced gifts phase. Some organizations call it the quiet phase, where once we have the materials, people will be meeting in asks, where we'll identify really the top 70% of the gifts through the advanced phase. So when you get to your kickoff event, you will be announcing that here is our campaign brochure. We are officially in the midst of a capital campaign, and we have raised 60 to 75% of the goal already. And then everybody else in the congregation is either contacted, solicited, however it works with your consultant or the culture of your church. And then there's celebration and thanks. If there's anything we don't do enough of, I think it's thanking and celebrating. Really, it's a great time to celebrate. Plus, you're going to be able to do projects that are going to enable some really great energy in your congregation moving forward. This is an example here of a campaign brochure for the final phase. This was a Church of the Advent in, I believe, Indiana. And in the back here, you'll see that there is a campaign prayer that we encourage somebody in the congregation to write. We encourage a committee to remind the congregation why you're doing this. It's a spiritual emphasis committee. It's often easy to get bogged down in the building, in the chores, in the work of all of this, and really lose sight of why we are doing it. And you'll see on the inside, this is very simple. You don't have to explain everything here because you explained it in your case statement. If, and this is a little bit small, but they have outlined all the different areas they're going to need to raise money for. If at this point, sometimes if you are building a new building or you have some major renovations and there's no right sizing the campaign, and you know that you're not going to be able to raise money to cover that during one campaign, there's a couple of ways to do that. If you're planning on financing the remainder of that, that should be in your campaign brochure. That's part of your plan. So your plan is that the congregation is going to raise $1 million over 3 years, and you're also getting a long-term low-interest loan for $500,000 to cover the remainder. That's part of the transparency communications there. So here's a quote from Henry Nouwen. We're pretty convinced that, or at least very grateful that Henry wrote this book. If you have not seen this book, it's a great little book. I would give it to vestries. I would have it available for people to look at. He just really phrases and puts money in such a spiritual frame, which I think we really struggle with when we're talking about this in the church. Ooh, is this a dirty thing? We're talking about fundraising. But this is one of my favorite quotes. The whole book is full of favorite quotes, honestly. People have such a need for friendship and for community that fundraising has to be community building. I wonder how many churches and charitable organizations realize that community is one of the greatest gifts they have to offer. If we ask for money, it means we offer a new way of belonging. I have a question from Catherine. Will the brochure be part of the slides you'll make available? There actually was a link today that was sent to you with your reminder email that had a link to the slides. And yes, these are all on there. And that brings me to just a pause. So if there are some clarifying questions at this point, some questions about what I've just covered that you want me to back up and repeat, or any that might apply to you or not apply to you, I just want to give you a pause before we move on. So the other thing that I wanted to touch on, we had a question before the webinar started, or not really a question. Catherine is looking at doing a 3 partitioned pledge over 3 years that includes annual capital and endowment needs. The reasoning there, she says, is because they don't want to rob Peter to pay Paul. And this is often the fear of congregations when they're entering into a capital campaign. How is it going to affect our annual pledge drive? When we train people to make asks, and when we're working with a parish from the beginning to the end, our stress and our reassurances are continually, your annual pledging is by far the most important pledge that somebody will make. When you're asking people to donate to a capital campaign, you are first asking them to consider their annual pledge. And then, and only then, prayerfully consider if there's something they can do beyond that. Often, we do dual campaigns where you're going to people and asking them at that point to consider their annual pledge. Then you sort of have a basis, and I find this works in a more busy society now, where people can really take into consideration both their pledges at the same time, because they're able to weigh, what does this mean to my annual? What does this mean to my own funds? Are we able to reach deeper? We've also found that in the end, if not during your first capital fund drive, over the years, people will increase their annual pledging. You've engaged them more closely in a mission that they're more aware of, that they've been included in. They are more likely to support it, and they have reached a little bit deeper than they thought they could through a capital campaign. That tends to have them more committed to upping their annual pledge. So that's my speech and preach about that as far as that's concerned. I'm going to, let me look at some of these questions here. They're coming in. What are fees that ECF charges? We will, I'm happy to call and talk with any of you. We are going to have some people check in if you have other questions. But we do set our fees on a sliding scale according to your budget and size and pledge numbers and that sort of thing. This is in order to make professional services available to even the smallest parish. So that varies. I will tell you that in Discernment, it's a daily, what we call a daily rate, where the parish pays for as much or as little of the consultant's time as they need during that time. So it's variable to everyone. The feasibility study and the campaign are all-inclusive fees. And we are talking about 3 separate contracts. So if you got done with Discernment and you discerned that this was the absolute wrong time to do a campaign, then you don't continue on. So really there are points all along the way where the parish can decide, we don't want to go any further. Diane is asking, in the discernment phase, should the recommendations be sent to the vestry before the parish? So I'm not sure of the recommendations you're talking about. So in the discernment phase, you may have recommendations that have already been figured out by committees. The way I do it, and all of the consultants do some things a little bit differently, but for the most part, you would communicate maybe the problems. I call the fact sheet. What are the recommendations, or what have committees been looking into? And make that publicly available so that people can think about it. The vestry is signing off on honestly, if you have a separate committee, what the committee has decided to go forward with. That's usually in concert with the vestry. Really, the only thing the vestry has to sign off on technically, I think legally, is your actual campaign projects, what you are raising money for. But all along, I think the vestry needs to be informed. So I'm not completely clear on the question. And Paul wants me to review the time periods required for the 3 phases. So again, discernment is that wiggly puppy. We're not really sure. If you've done a lot of discernment and you've really engaged, there are parishes now that have had small meetings, large meetings, really engaged with the congregation, have been talking about something for years. It could be that all you need is what we call a communications wrap-up, making sure that people now know the timeline, that the newcomers who haven't been here for the 3 years you've been doing this are up to date and understand your projects and honestly what's gone on before they got there. And then you can move on to feasibility study. Again, feasibility study is 3 months. Campaign is 4 to 6 months. They're the easy ones to answer. The rule of thumb. Okay, so do you have a rule of thumb on how the amount pledged through stewardship might predict the stretch amount for capital? And how many years is acceptable for pledging? The rule of thumb, you will hear everywhere from 2 to 5 times your pledge in plate. In my experience, I believe the consultants that are promising 5 times your pledge in plate are including your pledge in plate. It's a little trick. I see, and we see now post-2008, more of a 2 to 4 times your pledge in plate, and that's over 3 years. I have not done a 5-year campaign in 5 years. I think we just are too mobile a community now. People don't necessarily want to wait 5 years for the payout. It gets a little tedious with reminders, and by then people might say, you know, we have to start thinking about a new campaign. So really 3 years is the norm. But for that person who says, look, I will give you $5,000 a year for 5 years, you figure out how to take that. So often there are exceptions to the rule, that you do decide for some people you're going to extend that to 5 years. And Peter's asking, what do you think of the possibility of raising funds outside of the congregation in the general community? I'm so glad you asked that question. We often think that we have the support of the outside community. Why not? We're doing wonderful things for the community. We're wonderful. We might be the historical center of your town. We do great things. When a vestry asks me this question, I ask everybody around the table the last time they gave to the Roman Catholic Capital Campaign or the Congregational churches in town, their campaign. And that usually gets people thinking, I see what you mean. Generally, your community is thrilled to have you there, and they're thrilled that you're taking care of yourself. The exception here is if you have a very beloved or supported community service going on in your church, then you do have a special case. Another piece of this is if you go to your own congregation, you have a successful campaign, you raise a certain amount of money, and then want to go to supporters in the community to say, look at the great work we're doing for the community. Will you support us? We're already supporting ourselves at this level. That is a stronger stance to go to the community with. I say always invite the community in, but it's not going to make or break your campaign. You can't look for the big lead gifts there. It's always a great opportunity to include the community and invite them in. I have another statement here. Some rectors have expressed anxiety over a diocesan campaign that it will hurt their operations funding. How do you respond? Brian, I'm assuming that you're saying if a diocese has, let me know if I'm wrong, if a diocese decides to do a capital campaign, they are going to be infringing on some of the larger donors in the diocese, therefore pulling away the congregation's operating funding? Do I have that correct? Brian? Correct me, Brian, though, if I'm wrong. I'm gonna go with that interpretation of your question. So some rectors have expressed anxiety over a diocesan campaign. This is often the case, and it's the tricky let's say, delicate approach that a diocese needs to take when they are doing a capital campaign. Because you are reaching out to parishes and to individual donors to support a diocesan fundraising campaign. So absolutely, rectors fear, excuse me, that the diocese will be skimming off the cream of their own donors. This hasn't proven true, I have to say. I understand how rectors would think and fear this, and honestly, if it's a above-board campaign, this would have to be made clear to rectors to assuage their fears. People with the ability to give large donations to their church also have the ability to give large donations to their diocese, and they are most likely supporting many other charities that they're giving to. A donor is not going to say, you know what, my church doesn't need my pledge anymore, I'm going to give it to the diocese. This is sort of the natural human tendency to think there's only limited resources, there's a limited amount of money, and if we ask people, this also goes into the capital versus annual argument. If we ask people to give money to a capital campaign, they're going to have to take away from their annual. And that's just not the message. And there are fabulous spiritual reasons and donate, across the board, how, philanthropic reasons that this is not the case. People want to support a good thing. And if your church is doing a good thing and your diocese is as well, then everybody wins. I hope that that touched on what you were getting at. So one last thing I wanted to touch on here is, do you really need a consultant? I've spoken a little bit about that DNA that you do not want to leave a mark on for years to come. But why hire a consultant? Often people say, we don't have enough money. We're looking to get money now. How do we throw money to a consultant and, not get blamed for being foolish about that? There are statistics out there that are not ours. They're across the board on this, that some estimates say you could raise 30 to 25% more money than you would without a consultant. That more than pays for your consultant. The reason for that becomes pretty clear in many ways. A consultant will run more capital campaigns than a rector is likely to see in, certainly ever, than any church will see in its 100-year lifespan. We are able to change and stay with the times. We do have our consultants gather and try to exchange what they're seeing out in the field, if there are new trends, new anxieties, something that's worked really well or something that sort of had its day and isn't so effective anymore. You want your wardens and your rector to stay focused on running the parish. That's what they do. You do not want them sort of on the sidelines for 3 years. That's just not a good way to push forward your ministries. We're neutral. Honestly, we can say things to people and we can hear things that would make a volunteer really want to run for the hills. I also sometimes say to people, why would you want to do that to somebody in your congregation? Make them in charge of that. It's hard to hold volunteers responsible. The parish gets to hold their consultant responsible. If they're not following through, if it's not really working, you can fire them. A little bit more difficult with volunteers. You have the higher goal potential, and we are expected to adhere to the highest ethical standards. Again, the other thing that's not on this list is when you get almost to that goal, when you've almost reached that final goal, if it were me and I was a volunteer in the church, I'd say, okay, I've had enough. I figure the rest of the pledges will come in over the next 3 years, or let somebody else do it. We will push you over the finish line. And that's not just ECF. We would recommend any consultant is a much better idea than just trying to run it yourself. And here's the ECF speech. So why ECF? We would hope you'd consider us with a local consultant or another firm to look into and find out what works for you and your culture. We only work with Episcopal churches. We have in-depth knowledge of the Episcopal Church and are constantly working with dioceses and you name it, Episcopal, we do it. 25 years of successful campaign management. We do approach this spiritually. It is a little bit different in that we are in that same boat with you. We are struggling with the changing church. We are constantly struggling or wrestling with, is this our mission, and does this fulfill what we have said we're about? We have many other, I forgot to say this, as far as when you get to campaign and throughout the campaign process, we will work with you to get you set up with a planned giving program. We will make sure that your endowment does have sufficient structures and gift acceptance policies. If you want to set up a legacy society and get that in place, that also helps for your gift acceptance policies to go into your now ready endowment to receive gifts, and connect you with other churches that may be going through the same things or looking at some of the same struggles. I know I had a couple of people talking about keeping the rectory or selling the rectory and buying a house or giving the rector an allowance. So I know that's something a lot of people are struggling with now as well. Catherine is asking, what is the argument for a consultant if you have a highly experienced development fundraising professional within the congregation? The only argument there would be that that's a lot to put on the volunteer unless you're paying this person. A church fundraising is a little bit different than development and fundraising as a profession. I have worked in congregations where there's somebody on the vestry or somebody on the committee with those experiences, and they're very helpful. But usually they're the ones who say, you know what, this is my church, and I'd rather have this not ride on me. And you know, that's a huge responsibility to put on a member of your church. Certainly it's been done, and if the chemistry is there and the trust is there, then I'd say, you know, go for it. But you know, there are usually that person is the one who's making the arguments that they need to hire somebody else. But if they're willing to do it and it's going to work for the parish and people know what's going on, you do have transparency issues there. Does it become a blame game? That's the only thing I would worry about. But certainly it's been done and can be done well. So this is not a 100% diagnosis sort of thing. Leanne is asking, what is your experience with organ capital campaigns? Oh my goodness. Looking at 100 to 120,000 new digital organ. They are a mixed bag, I have to say. There have been very successful campaigns on organs. And again, this is something you learn in the discernment and the feasibility study process. What is the argument being made for it? Is there a music program? Will this enhance the ministry? Are there people who would feel awful without organ music? Often a congregation is split on this. Are you looking at a fund drive to fund the organ, or is it really a stretched capital campaign? So you could do an organ drive, or should you be identifying other things that are of interest to people and do it together with that? I'm working on a campaign now where they're getting a new organ, rebuilt pipe organ, which is just, you know, people feel very strongly one way or the other, but they're doing it with other things so that there's something in it for everyone. And those people who aren't so much in support of the organ understand that it's important for people. So again, that's part of that community building piece. For everyone to be able to hear why the organ is important, even if it's not their top priority, it's important to have the conversation. So happy to talk to you about that further, but very good question. Peter is clarifying, planned giving cannot be part of the capital campaign, can it? You're correct. So just as your annual isn't part of your capital campaign, we still work with you on that, because in lieu of having a capital campaign for an endowment, for those churches that don't have an endowment or want to build their endowment, often what's missing from their ability to do that is the clear expectation of what will happen to that money when I leave it in my will. So the planned giving part of a campaign is sort of the stealth underlying conversation that people are having. Often people will say, you know, I can't make a gift to the capital campaign, but I would like to leave the church in my will. This is an opportunity that shouldn't be missed. They may also say, and we ask in the feasibility study, would you like more information on planned giving, and have you left the church in your will? So you will already have identified those people who have left your church in your will and you didn't know it. And they will be the beginning cornerstones, or the often they're legacy societies that exist that have just gotten dusty. So we dust them off and get them up and running again. And they have new people and new spokespeople who have already remembered the church. So you start it there. So long after we leave, you're hoping that these seeds that are planted and the structures that are there will then go into building your endowment. Because again, our mission is to make sure that you have this new financial clarity, good financial practices going on long after we're there. So the next capital campaign, we'd love for you to call us, but we'd also love for there to be some gifts or some thanks and acknowledgement. That's the other piece, is thanking people while they're alive, and knowing people who are supporting us through plans in their wills. So I hope that's clear. It does not go to your campaign total. It is not a part of it, but it is the time to start talking about it. I see Brian is typing. Let me just go to my last slide here for you. This is, you can check out, we actually have a new website now that is a vast improvement over our old website. And there are lots of great resources there that have FAQs and outline our three-phase methodology and all at episcopalfoundation.org. And again, this is the Spirituality of Fundraising is that book by Henry Nouwen that I quoted from. And Not Your Parents' Offering Plate is also a really interesting read for your annual giving. Talks more about generational giving and how this is different than years ago when people just automatically made a pledge. If you have any other questions, we have a little bit more time. Otherwise, Brian is asking, do we pay as we go to ECF or after campaign funds received? So as I had said, there are 3 separate contracts, and they are pay as you go to a certain extent. So you will pay Discernment as you go, the feasibility study over time, and then the campaign is in 4 payments, which you start to get money really after about 3 months of the campaign. But that can be worked out. You are talking for the most part about a year that you'll spend in campaigns, so we do recommend you budget some campaign fees, some consultant fees into your annual budget. There's also other ways to do that. Often donors will say, you know what, I'll pay for that, or the diocese, more and more dioceses are offering to front the money to churches to be paid back when they start receiving funds. So there's a few ways to deal with that. But anyway, I think we've covered a lot. You have, well, my email. Wait a minute. Let me see. Last slide. There it is. That is my email, and Louise Baeto is our Senior Program Director as well in New York. Feel free to drop me an email, or Louise. We hope to be in touch with you just to see if there are any other questions we can answer. But please feel free to contact us, to give us a call. June, who is teching for us tonight, might be the person answering the phone at the other end in New York. So thank you. Thank you for being with us. And much luck and many blessings on your campaigns.